You demand the daily rations of 3 grown men. Your colossal size terrifies the livestock, and we cannot drag your immense weight across the mountains.
The brutal voice of the wagon master faded into the churning frontier dust. The heavy wooden wheels rolled mercilessly westward, carving deep ruts into the dry earth. Matilda stood frozen, abandoned entirely on the arid edge of a dying timber settlement. She did not weep. The biting wind lashed at her strong, resolute face, catching the tangled strands of her blonde hair, while her enormous, fiercely muscled arms tightened instinctively around a battered iron box. She was a woman forged with the proportions of a giant, towering and impossibly broad, yet her spirit fractured with the quiet frailty of autumn ice. Would you risk your own survival for someone the world had so thoroughly discarded? Stay with me until the end of this memory, and kindly leave a comment sharing where you are watching from to see how far this story travels. Because I promise you, what this harsh town believed about the giant woman left in the dirt was far from the whole truth. The evening sun bled an angry red across the bruised horizon. Matilda forced her heavy leather boots to move. Every single step sent a jolt of agonizing exhaustion through her thick, powerful thighs and heavy calves. Her faded red dress bore the dust of 1,000 grueling miles, exposing the bulging biceps and broad shoulders of a woman accustomed to breaking her back, for people who only saw her as a beast of burden. Society looked at her staggering height and tremendous musculature and felt immediate fear. They never looked close enough to see the gentle kindness hiding behind her exhausted, quietly observing eyes. She clutched the rusted iron box tightly to her massive chest. It was brutally heavy, solid cast iron forged in an older world, yet she guarded it as though it held her very heartbeat. Inside lay the absolute only inheritance she possessed in this unforgiving wilderness: the forgotten cast iron remedies, the ancestral foraging secrets, and the precious culinary wisdom of her late grandmother. The settlement she entered felt like a graveyard of broken dreams. Faded wooden facades leaned together, like exhausted men, waiting for a stagecoach that would never arrive. The wind whistled a mournful tune through the abandoned mining supply store. Fine red dust swirled through the empty main street, coating the saloons and the silent boarding houses. At the far end of the desolate dirt road stood a small, dilapidated diner. The white paint was peeling away in long, sorrowful strips. The large front window was clouded with deep, uninterrupted neglect. Ezekiel pushed open the creaking front door of his diner. He stepped onto the warped wooden porch and wiped his large, heavily calloused hands on a flour-dusted rag. He was a towering, thickly built frontier man with a dark, dust-covered beard and unkempt, shoulder-length hair. His sun-bronzed skin spoke of relentless outdoor labor, and his broad, powerful frame entirely filled the doorway. Yet, beneath his imposing stoic presence, a profound and silent grief weighed down his shoulders. He was losing the diner. It was the very last remaining piece of his late mother. The quiet agony of his continuous culinary failures chewed relentlessly at his honorable soul. He stood utterly still, his sharp, observant eyes scanning the empty, darkening street. Then, he saw her. Matilda swayed precariously near the broken hitching post. Ezekiel did not recoil at her astonishing size. He did not stare in fearful judgment at the massive, rippling muscles of her arms, or the imposing, masculine width of her back. He had lived through enough brutal mountain winters and unforgiving hardships to instantly recognize when a human soul was completely empty. He saw the violent tremble in her sturdy knees. He saw the desperate white-knuckled grip she maintained on the strange iron box. He saw a lonely traveler who had absolutely nothing left to give to a cruel world. Matilda tried to take one more agonizing step toward the wooden porch. The world tilted violently. The horizon spun into a blinding darkness. Her massive body finally gave way. She hit the dusty earth with a heavy, terrifying thud. Ezekiel moved with sudden, explosive urgency. He vaulted over the low wooden rail of the porch and rushed across the wide dirt street. He knelt immediately beside her towering form in the dirt. Dust plumed into the air around them. He reached out, his large hands remarkably gentle as he checked her breathing. She was alive, but her pulse beat with a frighteningly weak flutter born of severe dehydration and starvation. She was a true giant, heavier and denser, than most laboring men he knew. But Ezekiel gathered his formidable strength. He slid his thick arms beneath her massive shoulders and firmly under her knees. With a deep, grounding breath, he lifted her directly from the earth. He carried her away from the harsh, biting wind, bringing her slowly into the quiet, dim sanctuary of his failing diner. He laid her down carefully upon a long, sturdy wooden bench near the cold cast-iron stove. The diner smelled heavily of stale grease and burnt coffee, a lingering scent of inevitable defeat. Ezekiel fetched a battered tin cup of cool water from the hand pump. He returned to her side, watching her chest rise and fall in slow, jagged, exhausting rhythms. Matilda shifted weakly in her unconscious state. Her large, calloused hands slipped away from the heavy iron box she had clutched so fiercely for countless miles. The box clanked loudly against the wooden floorboards, the metallic sound echoing sharply through the empty room. Ezekiel knelt down to retrieve it. His roughened fingers brushed the cold, rusted metal. It was exceptionally heavy, far heavier than an empty box of its size should ever be. He turned it slightly in his hand, fully intended to place it safely on the table beside her resting head. As the dim ambient light from the setting sun caught the surface of the dark iron, he stopped entirely. The heavy box was not simply padlocked. It was completely sealed shut with a highly intricate, beautifully hand-forged mechanism, consisting of interlocking metal teeth and a strange, complicated hidden dial. It was a lock entirely unknown to this remote part of the frontier. It was the exact kind of heavy, unyielding lock specifically designed to keep out thieves, betrayers, and the most desperate of men. Ezekiel looked slowly from the mysterious, heavily guarded box back to the massive, exhausted woman sleeping quietly on his wooden bench. The silence in the dim diner thickened into a heavy, suffocating mystery. What priceless, potentially dangerous secret was this giant, abandoned woman guarding with her very life? There is a profound, sacred quiet that often follows a terrible collapse. When consciousness finally returned to Matilda, the deep shadows of the late evening had stretched completely across the silent diner. She opened her eyes slowly, fighting the heavy fog of absolute exhaustion. The air in the small back alcove smelled strongly of burnt grease and old pine dust, yet it carried a safe stillness that she had not experienced in many grueling months. She was lying on a long, sturdy wooden bench. Her massive, heavily muscled body ached with a dull, throbbing intensity. Every thick sinew in her powerful thighs protested as she shifted her tremendous weight upon the creaking wooden boards. Panic flared abruptly in her broad chest. Her large hands swept desperately across the rough woolen blanket covering her torso. Her thick fingers struck hard, unyielding metal. The heavy iron box rested perfectly safe upon a small wooden stool right beside her head. The strange, intricate lock remained completely undisturbed. A quiet, profound wave of relief washed over her weary soul. The large, heavily bearded man who had carried her from the dusty street had possessed every opportunity in the world to steal her only legacy while she lay helpless. He had chosen honor instead. Trust, a fragile and terrifying emotion for a towering woman so deeply accustomed to mockery and betrayal, began to take a tiny, hesitant root in her heart. A sudden, harsh clatter of metal violently shattered the quiet atmosphere of the building. Matilda sat up slowly. She swung her thick, fiercely muscular legs over the edge of the bench, her chunky leather boots finding the floorboards with practiced, deliberate silence. Despite her towering height and formidable, heavy frame, she knew exactly how to move without drawing attention to her massive presence. She stepped quietly toward the flickering light, bleeding from the kitchen archway, her broad shoulders brushing the narrow doorframe as she peered cautiously into the main room. Ezekiel stood before a large, severely rusted cast-iron stove. His broad shoulders were hunched forward in a tight, highly visible posture of deep frustration. Sweat gleamed heavily on his sun-bronzed forehead as he pushed a blackened, smoking skillet across the uneven iron grates. A thick, acrid cloud of gray smoke billowed upward toward the wooden ceiling, stinging the eyes. Sitting at the scarred front counter was a solitary patron, a lean, cruel-eyed timber cutter, chewing violently on a wooden matchstick. "You call this slop food, Ezekiel?" The timber cutter sneered, his voice dripping with absolute malice. "Your dear mother would weep bitterly if she saw what you have done to her beloved kitchen." You are entirely ruining the very last thing she left you. You should just surrender the deed to the bank tomorrow and spare this whole town the misery of smelling your burnt offerings." Ezekiel did not utter a single word in his own defense. He merely tightened his large, calloused grip on the iron handle of the smoking skillet. The knuckles of his powerful hand turned a stark, bone white. He stared down at the scorched, ruined meat sizzling weakly in the pan. The silent, suffocating weight of his failure hung heavily in the smoky air. He was a deeply honorable man, slowly drowning in a sea of culinary disaster, fighting a lonely, losing battle to preserve a motherly warmth he simply did not possess the skill to recreate. The diner was dying, and his stoic heart was breaking quietly along with it. Matilda watched the profound sorrow etching deep lines into Ezekiel's weathered face. She understood the crushing weight of public humiliation better than anyone alive. She looked closely at the rusted, neglected cast-iron stove before him. To an untrained eye, it was merely a ruined, useless piece of junk metal, ready for the scrap heap. To Matilda, it was a deeply neglected heart, desperately crying out for a familiar, understanding touch. Her grandmother had taught her that iron possessed a long memory, and it required patience, respect, and deep reverence to sing. She could not simply stand in the shadows and watch a kind, protective man lose his dignity. Matilda stepped fully out from the dim alcove and into the flickering lamplight of the diner. Her towering, fiercely muscled frame entirely filled the kitchen entryway. The cruel timber cutter stopped chewing his matchstick instantly. His nasty sneer evaporated into a pale, wide-eyed stare as he took in the sheer, overwhelming physical enormity of the woman standing before him. Her broad, masculine shoulders and bulging, powerful biceps stretched the faded red fabric of her dress to its absolute limits. She did not even grant the cowardly man a single glance. Her sharp, observant eyes remained entirely fixed upon Ezekiel. Ezekiel looked up from the ruined meal. Surprise flickered briefly in his dark, expressive eyes, quickly replaced by a gentle, quiet concern for her physical well-being. "You should be resting," murmured Ezekiel softly, setting the smoking skillet aside. Matilda slowly crossed the room, her heavy boots thudding softly against the worn floorboards. She stopped directly beside him. She was easily his equal in height, her massive frame radiating a quiet, formidable strength that made the kitchen feel suddenly very small. She reached out with a large, calloused hand and gently touched the cold, rusted edge of the dying cast-iron stove. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, feeling the neglected texture of the metal, silently reading the history of its total ruin. "You are burning the grease before the iron even has a chance to open its pores," Matilda whispered, her voice rich, deep, and remarkably steady. "The metal is completely suffocated by rust and despair. It has forgotten how to hold the heat. It needs to be reminded of its purpose." Ezekiel stared at her, completely captivated by the absolute certainty resonating in her quiet tone. The cruel timber cutter scowled deeply, tossing a silver coin onto the wooden counter before hastily retreating into the dark street, deeply unnerved by the imposing giant of the woman. Matilda turned her strong, resolute face toward Ezekiel. The flickering lamplight caught the golden strands of her slightly messy blonde hair, casting a warm glow over her hardened features. A spark of ancient, undeniable authority settled deep within her gentle eyes. She was no longer a broken, abandoned traveler lost in the unforgiving frontier dirt. She was a seasoned master standing before her chosen anvil, ready to work a very old kind of magic. "I need 3 things immediately," Matilda stated, her tone shifting into a quiet, absolute command that left no room for hesitation. "Bring me a large handful of coarse salt, half of a raw yellow onion, and a solid brick of cold bacon fat." Ezekiel quickly retrieved the requested items from the pantry, watching her with profound fascination. She took the coarse salt in her massive hands and turned toward the ruined, blackened surface of the stove. What forgotten, grandmotherly magic was she about to unleash upon the rusted iron? Matilda approached the rusted stove with the quiet reverence of a priestess entering a forgotten temple. She placed the items upon the worn, wooden counter. The coarse salt, the raw half of the yellow onion, and the dense block of cold bacon fat were the humblest of tools, yet in the hands of a woman who held the accumulated wisdom of generations, they were absolute magic. The thick, acrid smoke of Ezekiel's ruined meal still lingered heavily in the air, but Matilda simply ignored the foul scent. She possessed a singular, unwavering focus. Her towering, fiercely muscular frame blocked the flickering lamplight as she leaned over the heavy cast-iron surface. The metal was deeply pitted, covered in a tragic reddish-brown crust of absolute neglect. It was a stove that had given up entirely. She scattered the coarse white salt generously across the blackened iron grates. She picked up the raw yellow onion half, turning the flat, freshly cut side downward against the salt. With a deep, grounding breath, Matilda pressed down, her massive tree-trunk thick arm flexed with staggering power. The faded red fabric of her torn sleeve stretched taut against her bulging bicep as she began to scrub the metal in wide, deliberate, highly forceful circles. The coarse salt acted as a relentless abrasive, grinding violently against the ruined surface. The acidic juices of the raw onion seeped into the mixture, chemically breaking down the stubborn, suffocating rust. The sharp, pungent aroma of the onion immediately began to cut through the stale stench of old grease, filling the small kitchen with a clean, biting energy. Ezekiel remained perfectly still near the pantry doorway. He crossed his thick, powerful arms over his broad chest and watched her work. He did not see an intimidating giant to be feared. He saw a profoundly capable woman breathing life back into the dying heart of his home. He marveled at the absolute lack of hesitation in her movements. Despite her immense size and overwhelming physical dominance, her touch upon the rusted iron was incredibly measured. She understood the exact amount of heavy pressure required to scour the decay without damaging the precious metal beneath. For the first time since his mother had passed, Ezekiel felt a strange, quiet tightening in his chest. It was the fragile, terrifying beginning of genuine attachment. He watched the firelight dance across the heavy, exposed muscles of her broad shoulders, and he realized she was entirely magnificent. When the thick layer of rust was completely lifted, leaving behind a smooth, dull gray surface, Matilda swept the soiled salt away with a damp cloth. The stove was finally breathing again. She took the cold brick of bacon fat and rubbed it slowly across the warm iron. The metal hissed a low, grateful sigh. The fat melted instantly, seeping deep into the newly opened pores of the iron, sealing it, protecting it, and restoring its deep, glossy black luster. A rich, deeply savory aroma bloomed within the diner. The rusted ruin was gone. The iron was ready to sing. Matilda turned toward the wooden pantry shelves. Her large, calloused hands moved with practiced, instinctual grace. She retrieved a modest wooden bowl, a sack of milled flour, and a small jug of fresh water. She did not ask for a measuring cup. Her fingertips held the exact memory of the correct ratios. She sifted the fine white powder rapidly, adding a pinch of salt and a small dollop of the rendered fat. She poured the water in a slow, steady stream, mixing the dough directly with her thick hands. She lifted the shaggy mass onto the wooden board and began to knead. The sheer, overwhelming physical might of her broad shoulders pressed down into the dough, stretching and folding the mixture with relentless, rhythmic power. Within moments, the rough ingredients transformed into a beautifully smooth, supple orb. She flattened the dough into a thick, rustic disc and placed it directly onto the fiercely hot, newly seasoned cast iron. The dough sizzled upon impact, creating a sharp, beautiful sound of immediate transformation. Silence settled over the dim diner, save for the crackling of the wood fire and the steady, rhythmic ticking of the old wall clock. Slowly, the air began to change. The rich, intoxicating scent of toasting grain and hot, rendered fat wrapped around the wooden beams of the ceiling. It was the smell of pure, uncomplicated survival, woven together with the profound warmth of a well-tended hearth. Matilda stood watch over the iron, her strong, resolute face glowing in the ambient heat. When the bread was entirely finished, she slid it onto a wooden cutting board. She broke the hot loaf cleanly in half with her massive hands. A thick plume of fragrant steam rose into the cool air. She turned to Ezekiel, holding out one half of the steaming bread. Ezekiel stepped forward slowly. His large, sun-bronzed hands trembled ever so slightly as he accepted the offering. He looked at the perfectly baked crust, the soft, steaming crumb hidden beneath. He lifted the bread to his mouth and took a slow, deliberate bite. The crust shattered perfectly against his teeth, The warm, rich interior flooded his senses. In a single, devastating heartbeat, the towering, impenetrable walls of his stoic grief cracked violently open. He did not merely taste cooked flour and fat. He tasted the quiet, golden Sunday mornings of his distant youth. He tasted the gentle, ringing laughter of a mother long buried beneath the mountain snow. He tasted absolute safety. A profound, overwhelming wave of childhood warmth slammed into his chest, entirely disarming the hardened frontier man. A single, heavy tear escaped his sharp, observant eyes, tracking a clean, wet line down through the dust on his weathered cheek. He looked at the towering, fiercely muscular woman standing before him. The crushing, lonely isolation he had carried for years began to melt away in the presence of her quiet, formidable grace. The heavy front door of the diner kicked open with a violent, jarring crash. The bitter mountain wind howled viciously through the main room, instantly attacking the fragile warmth Matilda had just built. A sharp-featured man wearing a tailored, expensive wool suit stepped over the wooden threshold. His polished black boots clicked sharply against the floorboards as he marched directly toward the front counter. His eyes were cold, entirely devoid of mercy. The bank manager slammed a heavy, wax-sealed parchment down upon the scarred wood. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the quiet room. 1 week, Ezekiel. The bank manager smiled a cold, bloodless smile. You have exactly 1 week to pay your debts in full. If you do not produce the coin by Friday noon, this pathetic, worthless shack belongs to the railway investors, and the sheriff will throw you out into the dirt with the rest of the stray dogs. The heavy parchment seemed to burn against the scarred wood of the front counter. The bank manager turned on his polished heel and strode out into the biting wind, leaving the door to slam shut behind him. Ezekiel stared at the foreclosure notice. His broad shoulders slumped, the heavy burden of inevitable defeat pressing down upon his powerful frame. He had fought so hard, but the mountain town had finally broken him. Matilda stepped forward. She placed her large, calloused hand over the parchment, covering the cruel ink entirely. She did not speak. She merely looked at Ezekiel with her observant eyes, offering a silent vow. She had been abandoned, tossed aside because her tremendous size made her an outcast. She knew the agonizing pain of losing a home. She would not allow this protective man to lose his. When the morning sun crested the timberline, Matilda took absolute command of the kitchen. She moved with breathtaking efficiency. Her towering, fiercely muscular body navigated the tight space with delicate grace. She retrieved the iron recipe box, unlocking the strange mechanism with quick, deliberate clicks. She pulled out a faded card. Her grandmother had known exactly how to stretch tough cuts into a feast. Matilda selected a massive, cheap beef shank, coated it in seasoned flour, and dropped it onto the searing cast iron. The meat hissed violently, locking in the rich marrow. She tossed in roughly chopped root vegetables, wild thyme, and a heavy pour of bitter stout. She covered the massive pot, letting the low, steady heat work its slow magic. By noon, the most extraordinary aroma drifted out of the diner. It poured into the dusty street, wrapping around the cold, cynical hearts of the townspeople. It was the rich, intoxicating scent of slow-simmered beef, caramelized onions, and deeply roasted marrow. The front door creaked open. A group of rough, dust-covered miners stepped inside. They stopped dead in their tracks when they saw Matilda. She stood near the kitchen archway, wiping flour from her thick, powerful thighs. The solid red fabric of her simple dress strained against the imposing width of her masculine shoulders. The miners exchanged cruel, mocking glances. "Good Lord, Ezekiel," muttered the tallest miner, a nasty smirk twisting his face. "Did you hire a lumberjack to stir your pots? That woman is built like a draft horse. I bet she could pull a wagon by her teeth." A sharp laughter erupted from the men. Matilda froze entirely. The wooden spoon in her hand trembled. A profound, agonizing vulnerability washed over her broad chest. This was exactly how it always began. They looked at her towering height, the heavy exposed muscles of her bulging biceps, and they saw a freak of nature. The crushing weight of societal prejudice pressed down upon her gentle heart. She lowered her resolute face, trying desperately to shrink her massive frame. Ezekiel stepped out from the shadows of the front counter. His towering, sun-bronzed presence was terrifying in its quiet stillness. He did not yell. He did not raise his calloused fists. He merely moved his broad, powerful body to stand directly in front of Matilda, deliberately placing himself between her and the cruel men. It was a profound, silent act of public protection. "Sit down and eat," ordered Ezekiel. His voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded absolute obedience. "Or leave my diner immediately." The miners swallowed their nasty laughter instantly. They shuffled awkwardly toward the scarred wooden tables, entirely intimidated by the stoic fury radiating from the frontier man. Matilda felt a hot, unexpected tear prick the corner of her eye. Nobody had ever stood as an uncompromising shield for her before. She took a deep, grounding breath, drawing immense courage from his protective stance. She ladled the thick, dark stew into heavy wooden bowls and carried them to the tables with quiet dignity. The first miner took a hesitant spoonful. He chewed slowly. His eyes widened dramatically. The mocking sneer melted away, entirely replaced by absolute awe. The cheap meat was so tender it dissolved instantly upon the tongue, releasing a symphony of deep, comforting flavors that bypassed the stomach and went straight to the soul. Absolute silence fell over the diner. The only sound was the desperate scraping of wooden spoons against wooden bowls. Within an hour, the word had spread through the settlement. The diner was completely full. The townspeople crammed into the booths, devouring the old-world stew, deeply entranced by the grandmotherly magic Matilda had woven into the cheap beef shank. She watched from the kitchen, her heart swelling with a beautiful sense of validation. Her immense size no longer mattered. Her undeniable culinary skill had conquered their prejudice. Ezekiel stood beside her, quietly watching the bustling room. He looked at her strong, resolute profile, his sharp eyes filled with deep admiration. The diner was alive again. The air buzzed with genuine warmth and spirited conversation. Then, the heavy front door swung open once more. The bank manager stepped inside, bringing the cold wind with him. He stared at the crowded tables, his cold eyes narrowing in absolute disbelief. He marched toward the kitchen archway, glaring viciously at Ezekiel. "Do not think a single day of selling cheap stew to dirt-covered miners will save your pathetic deed," sneered the bank manager, his voice dripping with venom. "You owe a mountain of silver, and these strays pay in copper pennies." Ezekiel crossed his powerful, muscular arms. "The diner is full. The debt will be paid." The bank manager smiled that same cold, bloodless smile. "We will see about that. The Eastern Railway investors arrive in exactly 3 days. They are the wealthiest men to ever step foot in this remote valley. They expect absolute luxury. I am officially assigning you the contract to cater their arrival dinner. You will cook them a flawless, grand feast." The bank manager leaned closer, his eyes fixed intensely upon the heavy iron recipe box resting on the counter. "If the investors are impressed, I will forgive your remaining debt entirely," he hissed softly. "But if they find a single flaw in the meal, if they are even slightly disappointed by your giant savage of a cook, I will tear up your deed that very night. Do you accept the challenge, Ezekiel?" Ezekiel looked at Matilda. She met his gaze directly, her gentle eyes blazing with sudden, fierce determination. She gave a single, firm nod. "We accept the contract," answered Ezekiel slowly. "Excellent," whispered the bank manager, turning toward the door. He paused on the threshold, a wicked, dark gleam in his eye. "Oh, and I must strictly warn you. The lead investor possesses a terribly fragile constitution. If he consumes even a single drop of improper oil or slightly spoiled meat, he falls violently ill. I strongly suggest you watch your ingredients very closely. It would be a terrible shame if something mysterious happened to your food before the feast began." The heavy door closed softly. The cheerful noise of the diner suddenly felt remarkably fragile. Matilda looked down at the cast iron stove, a cold dread pooling heavily in her stomach. What dark, treacherous sabotage was the bank manager already plotting in the shadows? The morning air held the bitter, biting chill of high elevation. To cook a flawless grand feast for the wealthy Eastern investors, they needed obscure ingredients that common frontier coin could not possibly buy. The small mercantile store in the dusty valley offered nothing but heavily salted pork and mealy potatoes. Matilda knew exactly where they must look. She had consulted the heavy iron recipe box long before the dawn broke, carefully pulling forth a fragile, yellowed map drawn by her grandmother's own hand. The faded ink detailed the hidden hollows of the upper timberline, where rare wild mushrooms, mountain thyme, and sweet earth roots grew in secret abundance. Ezekiel saddled his old, reliable draft horse to carry the heaviest canvas sacks, but they walked the steep, treacherous trail together, side by side in the quiet morning mist. The ascent up the mountain was fiercely grueling. The old logging trail narrowed into a dangerous, rocky path carved directly through ancient, towering pines. Ezekiel watched Matilda move steadily ahead of him. Her massive, fiercely muscled frame navigated the loose, shifting stones with a surprising, quiet grace. The solid red fabric of her dress clung tightly to the thick, powerful columns of her thighs and the imposing width of her broad, masculine shoulders. Other men would have felt deeply intimidated by a woman who cast a shadow considerably larger than their own. Ezekiel felt only a profound, quiet awe. He admired the resolute tilt of her jaw, the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of her broad chest, and the unyielding strength she carried, without a single whispered word of complaint. She had survived a brutal lifetime of cruelty and rejection, yet her heart remained open enough to save his dying livelihood. It was a beautiful, entirely humbling contradiction that gripped his stoic heart. By the time the sun reached its highest peak, they arrived at a secluded ravine, deeply shaded by the massive, ancient mountain canopy. The thick air smelled heavily of damp earth, crushed pine needles, and undisturbed life. Matilda knelt slowly in the damp soil, her large, calloused hands parting the thick green ferns with the utmost gentleness. She unearthed clusters of rare, pale roots, wiping the dark, rich soil away as if delicately cradling newborn life. Then, she spotted the true prize. Growing directly beneath the heavy shadow of a colossal fallen redwood lay a magnificent sprawling cluster of wild golden mushrooms. They were the absolute cornerstone of her grandmother's legendary savory broth recipe. However, the rotting trunk of the massive tree had shifted during a previous winter storm, crushing the delicate fungi against the steep, unyielding rock wall. Ezekiel immediately stepped forward to clear the path. He braced his broad, powerful shoulders directly against the damp, decaying wood, digging his heavy leather boots deep into the slick mud. He pushed with all his formidable frontier strength. The thick, heavy muscles of his back strained violently against his worn work shirt. The massive log groaned stubbornly, but it refused to roll away from the stone surface. It was simply too immense for one man to move. "Allow me," murmured Matilda, her deep voice a steady, comforting calm in the quiet forest. She stepped up to the massive, fallen redwood. She did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. She wedged her thick, tree-trunk fingers deeply beneath the rough, rotting bark. She spread her massive stance, planting her chunky leather boots firmly into the earth. She took a slow, deep breath, dramatically expanding her broad chest. With a sudden, breathtaking display of pure physical dominance, Matilda drove her tremendous weight upward. The bulging biceps and immense shoulders exposed by her torn sleeves corded with terrifying, spectacular tension. She let out a low, guttural breath. The massive log groaned, cracked loudly, and finally surrendered to her absolute might. She rolled the immensely heavy trunk backward with an overwhelming surge of raw power, holding the incredible weight perfectly steady against the steep incline. Ezekiel stared at her in utter disbelief. The sheer magnitude of her physical strength was absolutely staggering. Yet, as he watched her carefully reach down with her other hand to pluck the delicate golden mushrooms from the earth, entirely avoiding bruising their fragile caps, his heart swelled with an overwhelming wave of pure admiration. She possessed the destructive, unstoppable power of a mountain avalanche, yet she deliberately chose to use it to gently harvest life. She was the most magnificent creature he had ever witnessed in his entire life. She placed the golden mushrooms safely into the canvas sack, slung across her massive back. She allowed the heavy log to settle back into the dirt with a loud, resounding crash that shook the ground. They continued their quiet labor together, completely filling the baskets with wild herbs, sweet juniper berries, and the necessary roots. A comfortable, deeply satisfying silence settled permanently between them. It was the beautiful shared burden of purposeful labor, slowly forging an unspoken bond far thicker than the mountain mist. But the mountain was a notoriously fickle and violent master. The comfortable, warm silence was abruptly shattered by a strange, unnatural drop in the air pressure. The gentle rustling of the pine needles ceased entirely. The sprawling forest grew eerily, terribly still. Ezekiel snapped his head upward, his sharp, observant eyes quickly scanning the thin slivers of sky visible through the dense green canopy. The beautiful blue heavens had violently churned into a bruised, terrifying purple. "We must move," commanded Ezekiel, his deep voice sharp and filled with immediate urgency. "Leave the rest. We must descend the mountain immediately." Before Matilda could even properly secure the thick leather straps of her heavy basket, the sky broke completely open. It was not a gentle passing mountain rain. It was a vicious, freezing deluge that struck the earth like physical blows from a heavy hammer. The temperature plummeted instantaneously, violently turning the warm afternoon air into a biting, icy whip. The storm wind howled through the narrow ravine, aggressively tearing heavy branches from the ancient pines and hurling them into the rapidly darkening shadows. Ezekiel grabbed the leather reins of the panicked draft horse, struggling desperately to keep the massive beast steady. He reached out his other heavy, calloused hand, blindly searching for Matilda in the sudden, blinding sheet of freezing rain. She grabbed his thick palm, her massive fingers locking securely around his hand with a comforting iron grip. They rushed blindly down the treacherous, rocky trail. The loose dirt had instantly transformed into a slick, deadly river of fast-moving mud. They were miles away from the warm safety of the valley settlement, and the very last sliver of daylight was rapidly evaporating behind the black, churning storm clouds. The violent wind roared with deafening fury, actively threatening to tear them straight off the side of the mountain. The blinding storm swallowed them whole. The freezing water soaked instantly through their rugged frontier clothes, chilling them to the bone. The narrow path forward was completely erased by the rushing mud and the absolute dark. The draft horse let out a terrified, echoing scream as a massive bolt of lightning completely shattered a towering pine tree just yards away from where they stood. They were trapped on the deadly, sheer incline, entirely blinded by the raging tempest, with the freezing mountain night completely closing its lethal, unforgiving grip around them. Where could they possibly hide from the wrath of the mountain? The blinding rain struck the steep mountainside with the deafening roar of a shattered river. Ezekiel tightened his calloused grip upon the slipping leather reins, pulling the terrified draft horse against the brutal wind. Beside him, Matilda leaned her massive, fiercely muscled frame into the howling gale, her chunky leather boots sinking deep into the sliding mud. The darkness was absolute, save for the brilliant flashes of lightning tearing the sky apart. Through the strobing light, the sharp, observant eyes of the frontier man caught the jagged outline of a deep recess in the sheer stone wall. It was a shallow limestone cave, concealed by violently thrashing pine branches. Ezekiel shouted over the thunder, pointing a thick finger toward the dark sanctuary. Matilda nodded her resolute face. She moved behind the panicked horse, placing her broad, powerful hands firmly against its heavy haunches, pushing the massive beast forward through the slick mud with an astonishing display of sheer physical dominance. They breached the threshold of the cave, just as a terrible wall of loose mud and broken timber washed over the exact spot where they had stood. The interior of the shallow cavern was bone dry, insulated from the vicious wind by thick stone. The immediate silence inside the rocky shelter felt profoundly heavy after the chaotic violence of the mountain storm. They stood together in the pitch black, their chests heaving with exhausting breaths, freezing rainwater dripping from their saturated frontier clothing. Ezekiel moved with practiced efficiency. He gathered dry, brittle pine needles and deadwood from the deepest corners of the cave. He pulled a striking flint from his leather pouch. With a series of rhythmic strikes, a shower of bright orange sparks fell upon the brittle tinder. A tiny flame blossomed in the dark. He coaxed it gently, adding thicker branches until a warm, steady fire cast a beautiful flickering golden light across the rough stone walls. The sudden warmth was an immediate blessing, but the brutal mountain cold had already seeped deep into their bones. Matilda knelt heavily beside the flickering fire. Her saturated, solid red dress clung tightly to the imposing width of her masculine shoulders and the thick muscles of her back. She reached into the canvas sack, retrieving a handful of hunecerro, of sweet juniper berries, and a few sprigs of fresh pine needles she had snatched from the entrance. "Hand me your tin cup," murmured Matilda, her rich voice barely rising above the crackling flames. Ezekiel handed her the metal cup from his saddlebag. She stepped briefly to the cave entrance, catching the heavy runoff of pure rainwater, then returned to the fire. She crushed the juniper berries between her thick, powerful fingers, dropping them into the water along with the pine needles. She placed the cup directly onto the hot stones, bordering the flames. "My grandmother always kept the winter frost from turning the blood cold with this," whispered Matilda, staring deeply into the rising steam. "The pine needle draws the heat directly back into the deepest dad's veins. The juniper settles the frightened heart. A body must be warmed from the inside out when the world turns to ice." When the dark liquid reached a rolling boil, she wrapped a rough cloth around the hot metal handle and offered it to Ezekiel. He accepted the makeshift tea, taking a slow, deliberate sip. The profound, earthy heat radiated immediately outward from his chest, chasing away the violent shivering in his powerful limbs. He handed the cup back to her. They shared the soothing broth in an intimate, unbroken silence, passing the hot metal back and forth as the storm raged impotently outside. The golden firelight danced across Matilda's strong, resolute face. The deep shadows softened the hardened lines of her jaw. Ezekiel sat close beside her, their broad shoulders nearly touching. He watched the profound, silent sorrow wash over her gentle eyes as she stared into the dancing flames. "You are an abomination," breathed Matilda. The sudden words, breaking the quiet atmosphere with the devastating weight of a falling stone. Ezekiel turned his head slowly, his brow furrowing in deep, immediate concern. "Those were the exact words the wagon master used," Matilda continued, her voice trembling with a raw, agonizing vulnerability. "He stood before the entire camp. He looked at my massive hands, the heavy muscles of my arms, my towering height. He told them all that a woman built like a draft horse possessed no place among civilized people. He declared my strength was a grotesque mistake of nature, and my presence alone offended the heavens. They left me in the dirt because my body terrified them. They could not look at me without feeling disgust." A single tear escaped her eye, catching the golden firelight as it fell down her weathered cheek. She hunched her massive shoulders forward, desperately trying to shrink her imposing, deeply muscular frame into a smaller shape. The profound shame she carried was completely suffocating. Ezekiel did not offer hollow platitudes. He did not speak a single word. He simply reached out with his large, sun-bronzed hand. He laid his thick, calloused palm directly over her massive, trembling hands. His grip was fiercely strong, perfectly steady T-ored and anchored in absolute honor. He gently squeezed her fingers. It was a profound, completely unspoken validation. His touch loudly declared that her immense strength was a miracle. Her grand size was a magnificent shelter, and she was entirely worthy of safety, dignity, and deep admiration. A beautiful, overwhelming sense of profound emotional safety bloomed within Matilda's chest. The terrible, suffocating fear of rejection began to completely melt away under his quiet, protective warmth. She let out a long, shuddering breath, her towering posture slowly relaxing. She allowed her broad, heavily muscled shoulders to drop their defensive tension. As she shifted her tremendous weight, the wet, heavy red fabric of her torn dress slipped down her right side. The thick collar fell away, exposing the heavy, bulging musculature of her upper shoulder to the flickering firelight. Ezekiel's sharp, observant eyes caught the movement. He froze entirely. Carved deeply into the thick, powerful flesh of her towering shoulder was a massive, horrific, violently jagged scar. It was a terrible, brutal mark of profound cruelty, twisting the heavy muscle into a permanent knot of raised, ruined tissue. It was not an accidental wound earned through hard frontier labor. It was a deliberate, monstrous brand inflicted by a deeply evil hand. Matilda realized instantly what he was looking at, A sharp gasp escaped her lips. She forcefully yanked the torn red fabric up, hiding the terrible mark, with a sudden, frantic desperation born of pure terror. Ezekiel felt a cold, furious dread settle directly into his stoic heart. What unimaginable, violent cruelty had truly inflicted that monstrous mark upon her gentle soul, and what terrifying monster from her hidden past still walked the earth? The violent fury of the mountain storm exhausted itself completely before the dawn. The morning sun breached the jagged timberline, casting long, pale shadows across the ruined, mud-slicked trail. Ezekiel and Matilda descended the treacherous slope in a profound, unbroken silence. The heavy canvas sacks, slung across the back of the old draft horse, were completely full of golden mushrooms, sweet earth roots, and the precious wild juniper required for the grand feast. Yet, the air between the two travelers carried a heavy, unspoken weight. Ezekiel walked slightly ahead, his broad shoulders rigidly set. He did not ask a single question regarding the terrible, jagged scar he had witnessed in the firelight. He understood that some wounds were carved too deeply into the soul to be carelessly touched by curious words. He offered her the absolute dignity of silence. And in return, Matilda felt the lingering, protective warmth of his thick hand completely anchored within her spirit. When they finally returned to the dying valley settlement, the biting wind had softened into a cold, quiet breeze. The diner stood exactly as they had left it. A lonely wooden sanctuary, waiting desperately for the hearth to be lit. Matilda immediately took to the kitchen. The heavy iron recipe box rested safely upon the scarred wooden counter, a silent guardian of the ancient culinary wisdom she was about to deploy. She began the arduous preparation for the railway investors. She took the sweet earth roots and employed a forgotten grandmotherly method to draw out the bitter starch. She buried the raw vegetables completely under a thick layer of coarse salt and dry pine ash, a brilliant technique that instantly sweetened the flesh while preserving the delicate, natural snap of the root. She moved around the hot cast iron stove with breathtaking efficiency. The solid red fabric of her simple dress stretched tightly across the imposing width of her masculine shoulders as she lifted heavy iron pots with effortless grace. By the time the evening shadows stretched across the dusty street, the diner was once again filled with weary townsfolk. The rich, intoxicating aroma of roasted roots and bubbleens marrow drew the hungry miners away from the bitter cold. The room buzzed with a lively, deeply comforting energy. Ezekiel stood behind the front counter, his sharp, observant eyes continuously scanning the room, maintaining a quiet, protective vigil over the towering woman laboring in his kitchen. The heavy front door crashed inward with a violent, splintering force. A massive, deeply intoxicated cattle drover staggered over the wooden threshold. His heavy leather coat was caked in dried mud and foul-smelling stable grime. He stomped directly toward the front counter, his boots striking the floorboards with belligerent aggression. He demanded a bottle of strong whiskey, though Ezekiel served only hot coffee and honest food. Ezekiel crossed his powerful arms. He refused the man in a low, absolute tone. The drover sneered fiercely. He turned his staggering, drunken weight toward the kitchen archway. His cruel, bloodshot eyes locked immediately onto Matilda. She was standing near the hot stove, wiping flour from her thick, powerful thighs. He stared openly at the heavy, bulging biceps exposed by her torn sleeves and the sheer, overwhelming physical enormity of her fiercely muscled frame. The drover spat a dark wad of chewing tobacco directly onto the clean floorboards. "Look at the absolute size of that monstrous beast," bellowed the drover, his voice thick with foul liquor and pure malice. "What kind of unnatural, grotesque abomination are you keeping back there, Ezekiel? She is built like a cursed ox. It ruins a man's appetite just looking at those massive, unnatural arms." The entire diner fell deadly silent. The lively chatter evaporated into a suffocating, tense void. Matilda froze entirely. The heavy wooden spoon slipped from her calloused fingers, clattering loudly against the iron stove. The familiar, agonizing weight of profound public humiliation crashed down upon her broad chest. It was the exact same cruelty that had driven her from the wagon train. She instinctively lowered her resolute face, her heart shattering as she tried desperately to shrink her towering, imposing body away from the cruel stares. The drover laughed a nasty, guttural laugh. He lurched forward, swinging his heavy arm wildly toward the kitchen counter. His thick forearm violently struck the rusted iron box. The precious, heavy heirloom plummeted toward the floorboards. It struck the ground with a deafening, terrifying crash of solid metal. Ezekiel did not hesitate. He did not issue a quiet warning. His stoic, restrained patience shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. He moved with the terrifying, explosive speed of a striking wolf. He closed the distance in 2 massive strides. He grabbed the drover by the thick leather collar of his heavy coat. The immense, heavy muscles of the frontier man strained violently against his worn work shirt. He lifted the struggling, heavy patron entirely off the ground, entirely ignoring the frantic, drunken fists striking his broad shoulders. Ezekiel marched directly toward the front door. He hurled the man violently through the open threshold. The drover crashed hard into the frozen dirt of the street, rolling into the deep wheel ruts. Ezekiel stepped out onto the warped wooden porch. His broad chest heaved with magnificent fury. "You will never speak to her in that manner," roared Ezekiel, his deep voice shaking the very timber of the surrounding buildings. "She holds more honor, more incredible kindness, and more profound worth in her calloused hands than this entire valley combined. She is the absolute heart of this home. Any man who disrespects her dignity will answer directly to my fists." The entire street fell utterly silent. The men inside the diner lowered their heads in deep, immediate shame. Matilda stood frozen near the cast iron stove. A beautiful, overwhelming wave of pure, undeniable belonging washed over her bruised spirit. A hot tear escaped her eye. She was truly safe. He had claimed her worth before the entire world. Ezekiel turned slowly back into the quiet diner. He took a long, steadying breath, the violent tension slowly draining from his powerful frame. He walked behind the counter and knelt upon the wooden floorboards to retrieve the fallen iron box. The violent impact against the floor had shattered the unseen internal latch. A thick, rusted panel on the very bottom of the heavy iron box had slid completely open. Ezekiel reached his large, sun-bronzed hand into the hidden compartment. He carefully withdrew a fragile, tightly folded piece of heavy parchment. He unfolded the ancient paper slowly under the flickering lamplight. It was a cryptic, heavily coded map, marked with deep red ink and strange, overlapping surveyor lines that perfectly matched the surrounding valley. Ezekiel stared at the forgotten document. What incredible, dangerous legacy had her grandmother truly concealed beneath the weight of the iron? The heavy parchment felt impossibly frail between Ezekiel's thick, callous fingers. He traced the deep red ink, mapping the surrounding valley with his rough thumb. The cryptic surveyor lines intersected perfectly over the exact location of the dying settlement. The geek, before he could fully process the dangerous implications of the hidden document, the violent clatter of heavily armed riders thundered aggressively down the dusty main street. The rhythmic thud of galloping hooves shattered the fragile, quiet peace they had just reclaimed. Ezekiel swiftly folded the ancient paper, slipping it discreetly deep into his worn leather vest pocket, just as a suffocating, terrifying shadow fell heavily across the warped wooden porch. Matilda stepped out from the warm safety of the kitchen. The solid red fabric of her dress stretched tightly, as her broad, heavily muscled shoulders instinctively squared against the approaching noise. She peered through the clouded glass of the front window. A suffocating, icy terror instantly seized her entire massive frame. All the blood drained completely from her strong, resolute face. The giant, fiercely muscular woman, who could effortlessly lift a fallen redwood, suddenly trembled like a fragile, broken winter leaf. Dismounting from a massive, sweat-lathered black stallion was a man with a deeply scarred, incredibly cruel face. It was the wagon master. He was the very architect of her profound earthly suffering. He was the ruthless, unforgiving tyrant who had ordered her entirely abandoned in the harsh, arid wilderness, mocking her immense, towering physique and discarding her to rot. Beside him stood the sharp-featured bank manager, a cold, bloodless smile twisting his pale face into a mask of pure malice. They moved together, with the undeniable, sickening arrogance of men who had successfully orchestrated a dark, terrible trap. "Stay directly behind me," ordered Ezekiel, his deep voice dropping into a lethal, quiet rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. The heavy front door swung open violently. The wagon master stepped inside, dragging the bitter cold of the street with him. His cruel, predatory eyes immediately locked onto Matilda. A dark, ugly gleam ignited within his gaze as he took in the clean, thriving state of the bustling diner. He smelled the rich, intoxicating aroma of roasting root vegetables and sweet juniper broth wafting from the hot cast iron stove. He did not see a dignified human being standing before him. He saw only a highly profitable, massive beast of burden he had foolishly discarded. "Well, look at this miraculous, unexpected recovery," mocked the wagon master, his voice scraping the quiet air like deeply rusted iron. "I leave a monstrous, towering freak in the dirt to perish, and she somehow crawls her massive bulk into a warm, comfortable kitchen. You have built quite a cozy little nest here, you giant. Ugly mistake of nature." Ezekiel moved with terrifying, deliberate purpose. He placed his broad, powerful body entirely in front of Matilda. The immense, heavy muscles of his chest and back coiled with explosive, terrifying tension beneath his worn work shirt. His weathered, sun-bronzed face remained entirely stoic, but his sharp, observant eyes burned with absolute, uncompromising fury. He became an impenetrable fortress of flesh and bone. "You will step back outside," commanded Ezekiel, every single syllable laced with lethal, immediate consequence. "You hold absolutely no business within the walls of my home. Remove yourself immediately before I break your jaw." The bank manager stepped forward smoothly, deliberately tapping his polished silver cane against the scarred wooden floorboards. "Unfortunately, Ezekiel, he possesses very pressing official business. It appears your giant, savage cook is not just a grotesque anomaly of nature. She is a common, desperate thief." Matilda clutched the edge of the scarred wooden counter behind Ezekiel. A profound, agonizing fear of loss ripped viciously through her broad chest. She had finally found a home where her tremendous physical strength was deeply valued. She had finally found a deeply honorable man who looked at her massive, masculine shoulders and bulging biceps with quiet, profound admiration rather than disgust. Now, the cruel, vindictive ghosts of her painful past had returned to utterly destroy her hard-won sanctuary. Her grandmother's cast iron remedies were the only tools keeping the diner alive. "I stole absolutely nothing," breathed Matilda, her rich, deep voice shaking with raw, terrified emotion. "You threw me away. You abandoned me to the wolves because my large size offended your fragile, pathetic pride. I took exactly what belongs strictly to my own blood." "Lees," barked the wagon master, taking a menacing, heavy step toward the wooden counter. "When you traveled under my paid banner, every single piece of property belonged strictly to the company. That included the heavy iron box you violently dragged around the camp. I claim the absolute rights to its entire contents. Hand it over immediately." The cruel man pointed a deeply tanned, accusatory finger directly at the rusted iron box resting upon the counter. The shattered bottom compartment was completely hidden from his view, but the intricate lock remained intact. He firmly believed it held stolen frontier gold or precious gems. He had absolutely no idea it held only ancestral cooking wisdom and a cryptic, life-changing map. Ezekiel did not yield a single inch of ground. "The box belongs solely to her family. You hold absolutely no legal claim over her or her inheritance. You surrendered your rights the exact moment you left her to die in the unforgiving dirt. Leave now before I throw you violently into the street." The bank manager let out a cold, sharp laugh. "I anticipated you would choose the foolish path of stubborn violence. Ezekiel, that is exactly why we did not travel alone." The heavy, authoritative thud of official boots sounded heavily upon the warped wooden porch. The town sheriff stepped slowly into the dim diner. He was a stern, deeply weary man who wore the silver star upon his chest with a reluctant heavy duty. He carried a tightly rolled parchment in his thick, gloved fist. He looked at Ezekiel with deep, genuine regret, then turned his tired gaze toward the towering, fiercely muscled woman hiding behind the stoic frontier man. "I am truly sorry," Ezekiel muttered the sheriff, slowly unfolding the heavy legal document. The wagon master filed a sworn, formal affidavit with the circuit judge over in the neighboring county. He firmly claims the iron box contains stolen company payroll. Because the iron box is currently residing on your property, I am legally obligated to execute an immediate search and seizure. The breathable air in the diner vanished entirely. Matilda felt the solid wooden floorboards dropping completely away beneath her chunky leather boots. The iron box was her absolute only remaining connection to the profound, grandmotherly love that had sustained her through a lifetime of brutal, relentless mockery. It held the exact grandmotherly recipes she desperately needed to cook the flawless grand feast for the arriving railway investors. If they took the box away, she would lose her entire legacy. Ezekiel would completely lose his beloved diner, and the fragile, beautiful life they were building together would instantly shatter into useless dust. "You cannot do this," whispered Matilda, her massive, calloused hands gripping the edge of the counter with desperate, white-knuckled terror. "It is my grandmother's true heart. It is absolutely all I have left in this world." Ezekiel stood incredibly tall, his broad, formidable shoulders creating a literal physical wall between Matilda and the corrupt men. He looked directly into the eyes of the sheriff, his sharp mind rapidly calculating the desperate, terrible odds. He was a deeply honorable man who fundamentally respected the law, but he would never, under any circumstance, allow absolute evil to strip away the dignity and the legacy of the remarkable woman he loved. The sheriff stepped forward into the tense room, heavily extending his gloved hand to take the iron box. Will the cold, unfeeling hammer of a corrupted law permanently strip the giant, terrified woman of her only ancestral legacy? Or will the stoic frontier protector completely risk the hangman's noose to keep her entirely safe? The sheriff extended his heavy, gloved hand toward the rusted iron box. The silence inside the diner was absolutely agonizing. Matilda held her breath, her massive chest entirely still, her strong heart breaking into tiny, irreparable pieces. Ezekiel did not reach for his heavy iron skillet or his hidden rifle. He reached for a power far more absolute in the rugged frontier. "You will not touch that box, Sheriff," commanded Ezekiel, his deep voice carrying the unyielding weight of a stone mountain. Under the territorial mining statutes of this exact county, any contested property that sustains physical damage upon a private freehold immediately falls under a strict innkeeper's lien. The drunken drover who just shattered the bottom of that box works directly for the wagon master. Therefore, the wagon master owes me an immediate debt for the damages inflicted upon my property and my patron. Until the circuit judge arrives to officially assess the financial penalty, that iron box remains legally bound to this counter. The sheriff paused entirely. He withdrew his heavy hand. He was a profoundly tired man who secretly despised the corrupt bank manager, and he instantly recognized the brilliant, ironclad legal loophole Ezekiel had just deployed. "He is absolutely correct," murmured the sheriff, looking directly at the furious wagon master. "The territorial law strictly forbids me from seizing an item held under an active innkeeper's lien. The circuit judge arrives in exactly 48 hours. The box stays exactly where it is until the gavel falls." The bank manager turned a violent, sickly shade of pale. The wagon master sneered viciously, his dark eyes burning with pure, unadulterated hatred. They had firmly expected the stoic frontier man to respond with mindless violence, resulting in his immediate arrest. They had completely underestimated his sharp, observant intellect. The corrupt men turned and stormed out of the diner, their heavy boots striking the wooden porch with frustrated malice. The heavy front door clicked shut. The immediate, suffocating danger evaporated, leaving behind a heavy, vibrating tension. They had successfully bought exactly 2 days. Matilda let out a long, shuddering breath. Her towering, fiercely muscled frame slumped slightly against the scarred wooden counter. She looked up at Ezekiel, her gentle eyes swimming with profound, overwhelming gratitude. He had stood against the absolute worst nightmare of her painful past, wielding nothing but his brilliant mind and his honorable heart to keep her entirely safe. "We possess exactly 48 hours, whispered Ezekiel, his dark eyes softening as he looked down at her strong, resolute face. "Tomorrow evening, the railway investors arrive. We must deliver a flawless grand feast. If we successfully secure their coin, we completely pay off the bank manager. Once I legally own this diner free and clear, I possess the absolute power to banish the wagon master from this valley forever. We will secure your freedom. Matilda, I give you my absolute word. The profound longing between them grew into a tangible, heavy heat within the quiet kitchen. Matilda looked at his broad, powerful shoulders and the deep, honorable lines etched into his sun-bronzed face. For her entire existence, her massive size had terrified every man she encountered. Yet this quiet protector looked at her thick, heavy muscles and towering height and saw only absolute beauty. She desperately wanted to reach across the narrow space, to wrap her massive, powerful arms around his broad chest, and to finally rest her weary soul against his steady heart. She simply nodded, channeling her overwhelming emotion into the one language she completely understood. The grueling preparation for the grand feast began immediately. Matilda moved around the hot cast iron stove with the unstoppable, beautiful momentum of a rising tide. The solid red fabric of her simple dress strained against the imposing width of her masculine shoulders as she furiously prepared the intricate grandmotherly recipes. She utilized her breathtaking physical power to effortlessly crush dense peppercorns with a heavy stone mortar. She stood over the steaming pots, her slightly messy blonde hair clinging to her damp forehead, expertly skimming the impurities from the sweet juniper broth. Ezekiel worked seamlessly beside her. They did not require spoken words. Their shared labor became a profound, intimate dance of perfect synchronization. When she needed the heavy sacks of milled flour moved, he was instantly there. When he struggled to properly dice the tough root vegetables, she gently guided his calloused hands, her thick, powerful fingers offering quiet, expert instruction. The diner filled entirely with the rich, intoxicating aroma of roasted marrow, wild thyme, and deep, earthy mushrooms. By the time the midnight moon cast long, silver shadows across the dusty frontier street, the intricate side dishes were perfectly prepared. The entire success of the feast now rested completely upon the main course. Matilda had requested a massive, incredibly expensive cut of prime beef, which Ezekiel had purchased with his very last remaining silver coins. It was safely stored deep within the cool, dark sanctuary of the root cellar, resting beneath the floorboards of the back alley. "I will retrieve the meat," murmured Matilda, wiping her calloused hands upon a clean linen cloth. "Requires a full night to properly absorb the coarse salt and the wild herbs." Ezekiel nodded, his sharp eyes reflecting the golden firelight of the stove. "I will prepare the heavy roasting pan." Matilda stepped out the back door into the freezing, silent night. The cold mountain wind bit sharply through her torn sleeves, chilling the heavy, exposed muscles of her broad arms. She walked toward the heavy wooden cellar doors, set into the frozen dirt. A sudden, terrible wrongness struck her observant senses. The heavy iron padlock, which should have secured the thick wooden doors, lay completely shattered upon the icy ground. The rusted metal was violently twisted, broken by a heavy sledgehammer. A cold, paralyzing dread pooled heavily in her stomach. She grabbed the splintered wooden handle and threw the heavy cellar doors completely open, entirely utilizing her immense physical might. She descended the stone steps into the pitch black, her large hands trembling as she lit a small oil lantern. The golden light flared into the damp, cold space. Matilda let out a quiet, devastated gasp. The beautiful, incredibly expensive prime cut of beef lay completely destroyed upon the stone floor. It was completely soaked in a harsh, bubbling chemical. The thick, acrid stench of pure, concentrated lye violently assaulted her nose. The meat was entirely ruined, rendered completely toxic, and entirely inedible. The cruel, corrupt bank manager had successfully executed his treacherous sabotage. The very heart of the grand feast was utterly destroyed. Without the main course, the investors would surely deny the payment. The diner would violently fall to foreclosure, and the sheriff would immediately seize her precious iron box. Matilda fell heavily to her sturdy knees upon the cold stone floor, the terrible fumes burning her gentle eyes. How could she possibly conjure a flawless, grand feast from ashes and poison, And what terrible sacrifice would they be forced to make when the morning sun finally broke across the ruined valley? The acrid, burning stench of the concentrated lye filled the damp cellar, choking the very last breath of hope from the frigid air. Matilda remained kneeling upon the cold stone, her massive, fiercely muscled frame trembling entirely with profound, agonizing despair. The ruined meat represented their absolute final chance. The cruel bank manager had successfully driven the final lethal nail into the coffin of Ezekiel's beloved diner. She gathered her staggering physical strength, pressing her large, calloused hands against the rough stone floor to push herself upward. She ascended the wooden stairs, her thick leather boots feeling incredibly heavy, carrying the devastating news back into the warm kitchen. Ezekiel stood waiting by the hot cast iron stove. He took one single look at her strong, resolute face, drained entirely of color, and immediately understood the profound tragedy. He did not yell. He did not curse the corrupt men or the dark, unforgiving mountain night. He simply walked toward her, wrapping his thick, powerful arms firmly around her broad, masculine shoulders, pulling her towering body entirely against his stoic chest. He offered her the quiet, absolute sanctuary of his honorable heart. "It is over," whispered Matilda, her rich voice breaking against his worn work shirt. "The meat is completely destroyed. We hold nothing left to serve the investors. They will take your home, Ezekiel. They will take my grandmother's box." Ezekiel rested his weathered cheek against her slightly messy blonde hair. "Then we will walk away from this valley together. A building is merely cut timber. You are the absolute heart of my home, Matilda. If I lose this diner, I survive. If I lose you, I hold nothing." His profound, completely unexpected declaration struck her gentle soul with the staggering force of a physical blow. He was entirely willing to abandon his late mother's legacy to remain beside her. A sudden, fierce, unstoppable fire ignited deep within Matilda's broad chest. She would absolutely not allow this profoundly good, protective man to sacrifice everything for her. She pulled back slightly, her gentle eyes blazing with sudden, terrifying determination. "No," commanded Matilda, her voice dropping into a powerful, resonant rumble. "We do not surrender. My grandmother did not forge her wisdom in times of absolute plenty. She birthed miracles directly from the ashes of poverty. Bring me every single tough, unwanted root vegetable remaining in the pantry. Bring me the cheapest, hardest forage we collected from the timberline. And bring me absolutely every piece of hot charcoal from the main hearth." Ezekiel did not question her authority. He moved with explosive, determined speed. Matilda opened the rusted iron box, completely ignoring the shattered bottom compartment. She did not require the cryptic map. She required the very oldest card in the deck. It was a desperate, forgotten survival technique designed to extract profound, luxurious sweetness from the absolute lowest ingredients. She took the dense, bitter roots and the tough wild forage. She did not peel them. She did not slice them. She took a massive, heavy iron Dutch oven and completely lined the bottom with a thick, heavy layer of burning, red-hot charcoal from the fire. She poured a staggering amount of coarse rock salt directly over the live coals. She placed the unbroken roots and tough forage directly onto the smoking salt bed. She covered them entirely with another heavy layer of coarse salt, effectively burying the ingredients alive within a scorching, oxygen-starved tomb. She sealed the heavy iron lid tightly, completely locking the violent heat inside. The intense, dry heat radiating entirely through the salt will forcefully draw out every single drop of bitter water, explains Matilda, her hands moving with breathtaking, desperate speed. It creates a massive, pressurized vapor chamber. It completely breaks down the dense fibers, transforming the tough flesh into a rich, velvety marrow substitute. It is the absolute poorest meal on earth, disguised as a king's ransom. When the evening train finally arrived, blowing its lonely whistle across the dusty valley, the diner was completely transformed. The warped wooden tables were draped in clean, white linens. The air smelled of wild pine and deep, intoxicating savory spices. The wealthy Eastern investors entered, their tailored wool suits and polished silver pocket watches, creating a sharp, stark contrast to the rugged frontier setting. The bank manager stood near the front door, an arrogant, sickeningly confident sneer firmly cemented upon his pale face. He had arrived specifically to witness their total, humiliating destruction. The feast commenced. Matilda served the sweet juniper broth, the golden mountain mushrooms, and the rustic skillet bread. The investors consumed the appetizers with growing, genuine astonishment. The flavors were profoundly deep, completely unlike the bland, overly rich meals of their Eastern dining clubs. Then came the absolute moment of truth. Ezekiel carried the massive, scorching hot Dutch oven directly to the head table. The bank manager watched with absolute, predatory anticipation, waiting for the humiliating failure. Matilda stepped out from the kitchen. She stood incredibly tall, her towering, fiercely muscled frame radiating quiet, absolute dignity. The solid red fabric of her dress exposed her powerful biceps and broad shoulders. The investors stared at her immense size, initially taken aback by her profound, masculine physical dominance. She did not shrink from their gaze. She firmly placed her calloused hands upon the heavy iron lid. With a swift, powerful motion, she lifted the lid. She utilized a small wooden mallet to gently crack the hardened, blackened salt crust. The crust completely shattered. A breathtaking, thick plume of fragrant, deeply caramelized steam erupted into the diner. The aroma was utterly intoxicating, smelling exactly like the richest, most expensive roasted marrow in the entire world. She delicately extracted the completely blackened roots. She sliced them open. The interior flesh was a vibrant, glistening, velvety gold. She served the humble forage, completely transformed by the violent heat of the charcoal, directly onto the expensive porcelain plates. The lead investor, a deeply stern man with silver hair and a notoriously fragile stomach, took a small, hesitant bite. He stopped entirely. His eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated shock. He closed his eyes, savoring the profound, luxurious texture that completely dissolved upon his tongue. It was undeniably the most spectacular, masterfully prepared dish he had ever tasted in his entire long life. Absolutely magnificent, breathed the lead investor, placing his silver fork down with deep, genuine reverence. This is not merely food. This is profound, beautiful artistry. I have dined in Paris and London, and I have absolutely never experienced anything quite this extraordinary. The bank manager's confident sneer completely vanished, instantly replaced by a look of absolute, sickening terror. The lead investor turned entirely toward Matilda, his stern face softening with deep respect. He stood up from his chair. "Madam," said the investor, his voice carrying absolute authority, "I am currently constructing a massive, grand hotel in the very heart of San Francisco. I absolutely require a chef of your astonishing caliber. If you leave this dying, pathetic valley and return with me on the morning train, I will personally guarantee you a magnificent salary, a massive, fully equipped kitchen, and complete, total financial independence for the absolute rest of your days. Will you accept my offer?" The entire diner fell deadly silent. Ezekiel stared at the floorboards, a profound, agonizing ache completely shattering his honorable heart. He had successfully saved her dignity, but the staggering, life-changing financial offer demanded she completely abandon him forever. The staggering weight of the investor's offer hung suspended in the fragrant air of the diner. A magnificent salary, a grand hotel kitchen, complete financial independence in a thriving city by the sea. It was the exact salvation Matilda had desperately sought her entire life. It was undeniable proof that her towering, fiercely muscular physique and calloused hands were not grotesque abnormalities, but rather the very instruments of pure, undeniable genius. She stood completely still, the heavy iron lid still grasped in her massive fingers. She turned her resolute face slowly toward Ezekiel. She did not look at the wealthy Eastern men. She looked exclusively at the stoic frontier protector. She desperately needed him to speak. She needed him to step forward, to claim her heart, to actively ask her to stay. Ezekiel remained perfectly silent. He looked at the towering, magnificent woman standing before him. He saw the beautiful golden light catching her slightly messy blonde hair and the sheer, breathtaking power radiating from her broad shoulders. He felt a profound, agonizing chasm violently tear open within his own chest. He loved her. He loved her with the desperate, absolute devotion of a starving man who had finally found true sustenance. But he possessed nothing to offer her but a life of relentless frontier labor, calloused hands, and a small, dusty diner, constantly threatened by bitter mountain winters. He firmly believed he was an unworthy, rusted anchor, actively threatening to drag a magnificent ship directly down into the mud. "You hold the entire night to consider the proposal, madam," murmured the lead investor, completely misinterpreting her deep silence. He placed a heavy stack of brilliant, solid gold coins directly upon the scarred wooden counter. It was the exact payment for the grand feast, holding enough wealth to completely shatter the bank manager's corrupt hold over the property. "We depart on the early morning train. We eagerly hope you will join us." The feast slowly concluded. The bank manager stalked out into the freezing night, his pale face twisted into a mask of pure, humiliated defeat. The investors returned to their luxurious railcar. The diner grew profoundly, suffocatingly quiet. Ezekiel did not celebrate their massive victory. He gathered the empty porcelain plates in absolute silence. He carried them to the wash basin, his broad, powerful shoulders hunched beneath an invisible, crushing weight. Matilda watched him from the shadows of the pantry, her gentle heart aching with deep, terrified confusion. The profound intimacy they had shared while preparing the sweet juniper broth and the charred root vegetables had entirely evaporated, instantly replaced by a cold, insurmountable wall of stoic restraint. Deep in the middle of the dark night, while Matilda rested in the back alcove, Ezekiel stood completely alone in the dim kitchen. The silver moonlight poured through the clouded window pane, illuminating the rusted iron box and the clean cast iron stove. Ezekiel approached the heavy metal. He retrieved a small handful of coarse salt and a fresh block of cold bacon fat. He rubbed the raw fat into the dark iron, moving his thick, heavy hands in slow, deliberate, agonizing circles. He was perfectly seasoning the metal, deliberately preparing the heart of the diner for a future he firmly intended to never see. True. Profound love is rarely measured by what a man fiercely claims. It is most accurately measured by what he is entirely willing to quietly surrender. Ezekiel walked silently into the back room. He pulled a worn canvas saddlebag from beneath his narrow cot. He moved with the quiet, deliberate precision of a man walking directly to the gallows. He packed his heavy leather work shirts, his mother's old tin coffee cup, and his remaining box of rifle cartridges. He did not possess much in this world. His absolute greatest treasure was currently sleeping in the adjacent room, and he was intentionally walking away to grant her the magnificent sky she so deeply deserved. He returned to the kitchen counter. He pulled the heavy, official deed to the diner from his vest pocket. He retrieved a glass inkwell and a sharp steel pen. With a remarkably steady hand, he signed his own name, officially transferring the entire freehold directly to Matilda. She could sell the building tomorrow, combine the funds with the investors' gold, and travel to San Francisco as an incredibly wealthy, entirely independent woman. She would never again need to fear the cruel mockery of men like the wagon master. She would be completely untouchable. He left the freshly inked parchment resting directly upon the flour-dusted counter, right beside the heavy iron recipe box. He threw the heavy canvas saddlebags over his broad, powerful shoulder. He took one final, agonizing look around the dim kitchen, permanently memorizing the exact scent of the wild herbs and the lingering warmth of her presence. Then, he turned his back on his home and stepped silently out into the freezing, unforgiving mountain night. A sudden, sharp drop in the temperature awakened Matilda. She possessed the deep, instinctual senses of a woman who had spent a lifetime surviving the elements. She sat up slowly, the rough woolen blanket slipping from her thick, powerful thighs. The quiet diner felt terribly, unnaturally empty. The profound emotional safety that usually blanketed the building had completely vanished. She swung her chunky leather boots onto the floorboards. She walked into the dim kitchen, her massive frame moving silently through the moonlight. She immediately noticed the cold draft bleeding from the slightly ajar back door. Then, she saw the counter. Her observant eyes locked onto the heavy official parchment resting beside her iron box. She stepped forward, her broad chest tightening with sudden raw panic. She read the elegant, dark ink. It was the absolute, unconditional surrender of his entire life's work, freely given to her. He had legally transferred the sanctuary to her name. Beside the paper lay the damp cloth he had just used to meticulously season the cast iron stove. A devastating, profound misunderstanding completely shattered her gentle soul. He did not wish to build a life with her. He believed she belonged to the wealthy investors and the grand eastern cities. He had sacrificed his own home to ensure she possessed the absolute financial freedom to leave him behind. Matilda rushed to the back door, throwing it completely open to the harsh, biting wind. She stared out into the dark, frozen alleyway, desperately searching the shadows. "Ezekiel," yelled Matilda, her deep, rich voice tearing violently through the silent frontier night. Only the howling mountain wind answered her desperate call. He was gone. He had surrendered everything to protect her future, completely abandoning his own. Matilda gripped the wooden doorframe, her massive, incredibly strong hands trembling with absolute terror. Where had the stoic protector gone in the deadly, freezing dark, and how could she possibly find him before the unforgiving mountains swallowed his honorable heart forever? Matilda did not stand idle, while the absolute love of her life marched blindly into the freezing dark. She did not weep over the ink-stained parchment left upon the flour-dusted counter. She moved with the terrifying, unstoppable momentum of a mountain avalanche. She lunged through the open back door, her chunky leather boots striking the frozen mud of the alleyway with explosive, heavy force. The biting winter wind slashed violently against her strong, resolute face and tore at the solid red fabric of her dress, but she entirely ignored the cold. She tracked the deep, heavy indentations of his boots, leading away from the dying settlement, her fiercely muscled legs pumping with staggering, relentless power. She caught sight of his towering, broad-shouldered silhouette just as he reached the absolute edge of the black pine timberline. He was walking slowly, his heavy canvas saddlebags slung over his back, leading his old draft horse into the unforgiving wilderness. "Ezekiel," roared Matilda, her deep, resonant voice entirely shattering the quiet mountain night. Ezekiel stopped dead in his tracks. He turned slowly, his weathered, sun-bronzed face etched with profound, agonizing sorrow. The silver moonlight caught the heavy mist of his breath in the freezing air. Matilda closed the final distance between them, her broad chest heaving violently from the sprint. She did not stop until she stood directly before him, entirely utilizing her immense physical might and imposing height to physically block his path into the forest. She aggressively thrust the folded parchment deed directly against his broad, muscular chest. "You do not possess the right to decide my absolute worth," breathed Matilda, her voice trembling with raw, overwhelming emotion. "You do not get to cast me away into the wealthy eastern cities because you falsely believe you lack value. I spent my entire existence surrounded by people who looked at my heavy muscles and my towering stature and saw only a beast of burden. I will absolutely not allow the one honorable man who finally saw my gentle heart to walk away into the ice." Ezekiel stared up into her fierce, observant eyes. His thick, calloused hands slowly reached up to take the parchment. "I hold absolutely nothing to give you," whispered Ezekiel, his stoic restraint completely breaking apart. "The investor offers you the entire world. I offer you nothing but a rusted cast iron stove and a mountain of endless, brutal labor." Matilda reached out her massive, heavy hands. She grasped the thick leather lapels of his worn frontier jacket, pulling his powerful frame slightly closer to her own. "I do not want the entire world," commanded Matilda softly. "I want the exact rusted stove where my grandmother's magic finally came alive. I want the quiet sanctuary of the kitchen, and I want the deeply honorable, protective man standing before me. My home is not in San Francisco. My home is standing right here in the freezing mud." A profound, overwhelming wave of pure relief washed entirely over Ezekiel's stoic soul. He dropped the leather reins of the horse. He did not speak another word. He simply nodded his head, completely surrendering his foolish, noble sacrifice to her absolute certainty. They turned together, walking slowly back toward the dark diner, the harsh mountain wind suddenly feeling entirely powerless against the warmth radiating between them. When they returned to the dim sanctuary of the kitchen, the heavy silence remained. The raw emotion flooding their hearts was simply too massive, too profound for spoken language. Matilda did not try to force words into the quiet space. She moved instinctively toward the pantry shelves. She retrieved a heavy sack of milled flour, a crock of fresh spring water, a small measure of coarse salt, and her precious jar of wild yeast. She poured the flour onto the scarred wooden counter, creating a wide, pale mountain in the moonlight. She formed a deep well in the center. She was initiating the oldest, most sacred ritual of her ancestral heritage. Ezekiel understood completely. He stepped up directly beside her, his broad shoulders brushing gently against her, imposing, heavily muscled arms. He rolled up the sleeves of his work shirt, exposing his thick, sun-bronzed forearms. He plunged his large, calloused hands directly into the warm water, washing away the freezing dirt of the night. They began to bake together. Matilda poured the liquid into the flour. Ezekiel used his thick fingers to gently fold the dry edges inward. Their hands moved within the large wooden bowl, a beautiful, entirely unspoken dance of perfect synchronization. When the shaggy dough finally formed, Matilda lifted it onto the wooden board. She pressed the massive, heavy weight of her formidable shoulders down into the dough, stretching the gluten with staggering rhythmic power. Ezekiel placed his large hands directly over hers. He added his immense frontier strength to her own. They pushed and folded the dough together in the quiet dark. It was an incredibly intimate, deeply tactile confession of absolute devotion. The rough calluses of his palms dragged beautifully against the thick, powerful knuckles of her heavy hands. The friction generated a profound, intoxicating heat. They stood incredibly close, their towering bodies moving in perfect, shared rhythm, the scent of wild yeast and raw flour rising into the warm air. The physical labor completely dissolved the remaining barriers between them. Every single push of the dough communicated profound safety. Every single fold communicated absolute trust. They were entirely weaving their lonely, battered souls together into a single, unbreakable bond, forging a deeply permanent union in the quiet hours of the frontier night. When the dough was perfectly smooth and incredibly elastic, they placed it gently into the warm cast iron Dutch oven. They stood together before the hot stove, waiting for the bread to bake. Ezekiel slowly reached out. He placed his thick arm around her broad, masculine waist, pulling her entirely against his side. Matilda rested her strong, resolute face against his powerful shoulder, a beautiful, overwhelming peace settling permanently into her chest. Then, the profound, beautiful quiet was violently shattered. A deafening, frantic metallic scream violently assaulted the silent valley. Clang. 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 It was the absolute, unmistakable terror of the town fire bell. Ezekiel snapped his head toward the clouded front window. A terrifying, sickly orange glow violently illuminated the dusty main street. The thick, suffocating stench of burning pine boards and melting tar aggressively invaded the diner. Flames were rising violently from the bank manager's office next door, and the vicious wind was blowing the raging inferno directly toward the wooden walls of their sanctuary. The deafening, frantic, metallic scream of the town fire bell violently assaulted the silent valley. Ezekiel snapped his head toward the clouded front window. A terrifying, sickly orange glow violently illuminated the dusty main street. The thick, suffocating stench of burning pine boards and melting tar aggressively invaded the quiet diner. Flames were rising violently from the office of the bank manager next door. The vicious mountain wind was blowing the raging inferno directly toward the wooden walls of their sanctuary. A shared, heavy wooden awning connected the two buildings together over the boardwalk. The dry pine shingles of the awning were already catching the deadly, flying sparks. If that wooden bridge completely burned, the fire would instantly spread to the diner. The beautiful sanctuary they had fought so hard to protect would be entirely reduced to ash. "Stay inside," roared Ezekiel, his deep voice cutting fiercely through the rising panic. He grabbed a heavy iron felling axe from beside the front door. He threw himself out onto the warped wooden porch. The heat of the fire was absolutely blistering. Thick, Suffocating black smoke rolled heavily through the dusty street. Panic consumed the settlement. Frightened townsfolk ran blindly through the shadows, carrying useless wooden buckets of water. The corrupt bank manager stood far away from the blaze, his pale face reflecting the dancing flames, watching his own corrupt empire burn to the ground. Ezekiel completely ignored the chaos. He swung the heavy iron axe with desperate, explosive power. The sharp steel bit deeply into the thick wooden support beam of the awning. He swung again. Wood splintered violently. Burning sparks showered down upon his broad, powerful shoulders. He coughed violently, his lungs burning from the toxic smoke. He needed to completely sever the structural connection before the fire crossed the gap. He was fighting with the absolute fury of a protector defending his home. Matilda did not stay inside the safe kitchen. She stood in the open doorway, her strong, resolute face illuminated by the terrifying orange glow. She watched Ezekiel fiercely battling the blazing structure. He was a deeply honorable man, violently fighting a monster he simply could not defeat alone. The heavy wooden support beam was incredibly thick. The fire was moving far too quickly across the dry shingles. A massive, flaming section of the bank roof suddenly groaned with a sickening, cracking sound. The structural integrity of the burning building completely failed. A colossal flaming timber broke loose from the upper floor. It plummeted directly toward the wooden awning. If it struck the awning, the entire flaming structure would collapse directly on top of Ezekiel, crushing his powerful frame beneath a mountain of burning wood. Matilda moved. She possessed the unstoppable, terrifying momentum of a charging locomotive. She lunged off the wooden porch and directly into the suffocating, blistering heat. The solid red fabric of her dress whipped fiercely in the firestorm. She completely ignored the searing temperature, burning her exposed, heavily muscled arms. She reached the heavy wooden support beam, exactly as the flaming timber above began its deadly final descent. Ezekiel, move, bellowed Matilda, her resonant voice echoing with absolute authority above the roaring fire. She did not wait for his compliance. She shoved his broad, powerful frame violently backward into the frozen dirt of the street. She turned entirely toward the thick, smoking support beam. Ezekiel had chopped halfway through the thick wood, but it remained incredibly strong. Matilda planted her chunky leather boots deep into the frozen mud. She wrapped her massive, calloused hands directly around the splintered, burning wood. She felt the searing heat instantly bite into her thick palms, but she absolutely refused to let go. She expanded her broad, masculine chest, drawing a massive lungful of smoky air. She unleashed her breathtaking physical might. The heavy, bulging biceps of her arms corded with terrifying, spectacular tension. The thick muscles of her broad back strained completely against the red fabric of her dress. She let out a guttural, earth-shaking roar. She twisted her towering, fiercely muscled frame with absolute, overwhelming violence. The thick wooden beam cracked loudly. She pulled again, utilizing every single ounce of her immense frontier strength. The wood screamed in absolute surrender. The thick beam violently snapped completely in half. With a deafening, catastrophic crash, the entire wooden awning tore completely away from the diner. Matilda forcefully hurled the heavy, burning wreckage directly backward into the street, entirely severing the lethal connection. The flaming timber from the roof crashed harmlessly onto the detached debris, completely missing the diner. The sanctuary was entirely safe. The fire would not spread. She had successfully saved his home, and she had completely saved his life. But the unforgiving mountain always demanded a heavy, physical price. The blistering heat and the sheer, agonizing physical exertion finally caught up to her massive body. A vicious, searing pain ripped violently through her right shoulder, exactly where the terrible, jagged scar lay hidden beneath her dress. The immense, overwhelming strain of tearing down the structure had violently reopened the old, brutal wound, tearing the deeply healed tissue apart. Warm blood seeped rapidly through the torn sleeve of her dress, mixing heavily with the thick soot and dark ash raining down from the night sky. Matilda staggered backward away from the heat. The terrifying adrenaline instantly vanished from her heavy bloodstream. The world tilted violently into absolute darkness. Her sturdy, powerful knees buckled entirely beneath her tremendous weight. Ezekiel was there instantly. He scrambled from the dirt, his weathered face masked in absolute, suffocating terror. He caught her towering, incredibly heavy frame just before she struck the frozen ground. He gathered her massive body firmly into his thick, powerful arms, lifting her entirely away from the burning street. He carried her quickly back into the safe, dim sanctuary of the kitchen, kicking the back door firmly shut against the swirling smoke. In the chaotic, frantic rush to bring her inside, the heavy leather boot of the frontier man accidentally struck the scarred wooden counter. The violent impact sent the heavy iron recipe box plummeting directly to the floor. It struck the ground with a resounding metallic clang. The shattered bottom panel completely broke apart. Ezekiel laid the unconscious, bleeding giant woman gently upon the cool wooden floorboards. He knelt beside her, his stoic heart shattering into 1,000 agonizing pieces as he pressed a clean cloth against her bleeding shoulder. He glanced quickly toward the fallen box. The rusted iron had spilled its absolute final secret onto the ash-covered floor. It was not just the cryptic map. A thick, heavy bundle of deeply aged legal documents had fallen from the hidden compartment, bearing the official, unmistakable wax seal of the territorial governor from 50 years ago. What absolute, world-shattering legal authority did the abandoned giant woman truly possess over the corrupt men of this valley? And how would this ancient paper change their entire destiny? The blinding, harsh light of the morning sun crept slowly through the clouded front window of the quiet diner. The terrifying inferno next door had finally burned itself into a smoldering, black ruin, completely stopped by the violent gap Matilda had created in the street. Inside the dim kitchen, Ezekiel stood entirely still before the hot cast iron stove. He did not possess the ancestral magic of the giant woman, but he possessed a profoundly devoted heart. He remembered the exact cooking tip she had taught him in the freezing mountain cave. He crushed the sweet juniper berries between his heavy calloused fingers. He dropped them into the boiling water along with fresh pine needles and a thick, rich piece of roasted bone marrow saved from the grand feast. He was brewing the ancient, restorative broth designed to pull the winter chill directly from the blood and bind the broken flesh. Matilda lay quietly upon the narrow wooden cot in the back room. Her towering, fiercely muscled body filled the small space entirely. Ezekiel approached her resting form with the utmost quiet reverence. He carried the steaming tin cup of healing broth. He sat upon the edge of the cot. He looked down at the massive, jagged scar marring the thick muscles of her broad shoulder. He had carefully cleaned the wound during the dark night, wrapping the heavy, powerful bicep in clean white linen. He did not see a grotesque injury. He saw the absolute, undeniable proof of her profound sacrifice. Matilda slowly opened her gentle eyes. The agonizing, sharp pain in her shoulder had softened into a dull, heavy ache, completely soothed by his meticulous care. She looked at the weathered, sun-bronzed face of her protector. Ezekiel lifted the tin cup to her lips. She took a slow, deliberate swallow. The rich, earthy heat of the marrow and the sharp, bright pine immediately flooded her chest, chasing away the lingering shadow of the violent firestorm. It tasted exactly like absolute safety. It tasted like home. A beautiful, overwhelming peace settled permanently into her gentle soul. She reached up with her large, heavy hand, resting her thick fingers against his rough cheek. He leaned directly into her calloused palm, completely surrendering his stoic restraint to her quiet grace. "You saved my home," murmured Ezekiel, his deep voice thick with raw, unrestrained emotion. "You saved my life. And you completely broke the iron lock." Ezekiel turned toward the small, wooden stool beside the cot. He carefully picked up the heavy bundle of aged, yellowed parchment that had spilled violently from the shattered iron box. He placed the ancient documents directly onto the rough woolen blanket covering her thick, powerful thighs. Matilda stared at the heavy red wax seal, completely pressing the pages together. It was the official, unmistakable crest of the territorial governor, dated over 50 years in the past. She reached out, her thick fingers trembling slightly as she gently broke the brittle wax. She unfolded the fragile parchment. Ezekiel leaned forward, his sharp, observant eyes scanning the elegant, faded ink. The cryptic map they had utilized to forage for wild golden mushrooms and sweet earth roots was not merely a guide to hidden culinary ingredients. The specific, obscure locations of the ancient pine trees and the deep limestone caves were exact, registered boundary markers. The grandmother of Matilda was not simply a humble pioneer cook. She was the very first settler to successfully map the unforgiving mountain valley. "This is a master deed," breathed Ezekiel, absolute staggering disbelief washing entirely over his honorable face. "This document legally grants the absolute, irrevocable ownership of the mineral rights, the timber rights, and the entire valley floor, directly to your family line. The state legally recognizes your grandmother as the sole, rightful proprietor of this land." Matilda felt the breathable air completely vanish from the small room. She stared blindly at the ancient ink. Ezekiel pointed a thick finger at the formal boundary descriptions. The corrupt bank manager built his entire wealthy empire directly upon unrecorded, stolen earth. Every single foreclosure he issued, every single deed he violently seized from the desperate townsfolk, is completely fraudulent and entirely legally void. His ruined bank sits directly upon your property. This diner sits directly upon your property. You do not just possess the knowledge to cook a grand feast, Matilda. You legally own the very dirt beneath our boots. The profound, absolute magnitude of the revelation completely shattered the quiet air. For her entire agonizing existence, society had fiercely rejected her. The cruel wagon master had abandoned her in the arid dirt because her towering height and massive, heavily muscled arms terrified his fragile pride. The drunken drover had openly mocked the imposing width of her masculine shoulders. The wealthy Eastern investors had viewed her solely as an exotic, highly profitable servant to acquire for their grand hotel. They had all looked at her sheer physical enormity and completely failed to see her true, undeniable worth. Now, the absolute, undeniable truth lay perfectly illuminated upon the woolen blanket. She was not a discarded beast of burden. She was the absolute, legal master of the entire mountain territory. A sudden, terrifyingly silent power settled heavily into the broad, formidable chest of the giant woman. She slowly sat up, entirely ignoring the heavy ache in her torn shoulder. The solid red fabric of her dress shifted over her thick, powerful frame. She possessed the heavy, official parchment in her calloused hands. She held the absolute, indisputable, legal authority to completely destroy the men who had tormented her. She could summon the circuit judge and immediately order the corrupt bank manager thrown violently into the freezing frontier prison. She could legally seize the entire wagon train, stripping the cruel wagon master of his wealth and violently casting him out into the wilderness to starve, exactly as he had done to her. She held the sharp, unforgiving sword of absolute justice directly in her massive grip, with the staggering, undeniable power to completely ruin the cruel, corrupt tormentors who had mocked her immense physical size. How would the giant, fiercely muscled woman finally choose to wield this terrifying new authority? When the circuit judge arrived at noon, the heavy wooden wheels of the official carriage ground to a halt in the center of the dusty main street exactly at noon. The circuit judge stepped down into the cold mountain air. He was a deeply weathered, uncompromising man who carried the heavy book of territorial law beneath his thick woolen coat. The cruel wagon master and the pale bank manager stood together near the shattered remains of the burning wooden awning. They wore masks of absolute, sickening triumph. They firmly believed the hour of their ultimate victory had finally arrived. They expected to see Ezekiel dragged away in heavy iron chains, and they fully expected to strip the towering, giant woman of her precious iron box and cast her violently back into the unforgiving wilderness. The heavy front door of the diner opened slowly. Ezekiel stepped out onto the warped wooden porch. His broad, powerful shoulders were relaxed, and his sun-bronzed face carried a profound, unbreakable peace. He did not hold his heavy rifle. He simply stood aside. Matilda emerged from the dim sanctuary. She stood incredibly tall, her towering, fiercely muscled frame commanding the absolute attention of the entire valley. The solid red fabric of her dress exposed the massive, bulging biceps of her arms, and the thick, white linen bandage wrapped carefully around her right shoulder spoke silently of her incredible courage. She did not lower her strong, resolute face. She did not try to shrink her heavy, masculine proportions away from the staring eyes of the townsfolk. She walked directly toward the circuit judge, carrying the ancient, heavy parchment in her massive, calloused hands. "I submit the original master deed for this entire territory," declared Matilda, her deep, resonant voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. "Drafted and sealed by the territorial governor 50 years ago, granting absolute ownership of this valley completely to my family line." The circuit judge took the fragile paper. He examined the heavy red wax seal and the elegant faded ink with sharp, meticulous eyes. The dusty street fell deadly silent. The pale bank manager suddenly began to tremble violently. The cruel wagon master completely lost his arrogant sneer. "This document is entirely authentic and legally absolute," proclaimed the circuit judge, his stern voice echoing against the wooden buildings. "The bank possesses absolutely no legal claim over this town. Every single foreclosure issued upon this land is entirely fraudulent and legally void. Madam, you currently hold the absolute power of the law. You may formally charge these men with grand fraud, theft, and trespass. I will see them both locked in the territorial prison before the sun sets." The wagon master took a terrified, staggering step backward. The men who had mocked her immense size now looked up at her towering figure with pure, unadulterated terror. They waited for the heavy hammer of her rightful vengeance to violently strike them down. Matilda looked at the deeply scarred, cruel face of the wagon master. She remembered the agonizing, brutal humiliation she had suffered when he abandoned her in the dirt. She possessed the absolute power to completely destroy him. Yet, as she looked at his cowering, pathetic form, she felt absolutely no desire for vengeance. She realized true strength was not merely the ability to crush an enemy. True strength was the profound capacity to completely outgrow them. "I will not build my home upon a foundation of cruelty," commanded Matilda gently, her gentle eyes completely clear. "I legally pardon the entire town of their fraudulent debts. The land belongs to the people who labor upon it. As for you two, you will leave this valley immediately. You hold absolutely no power here. I release you to the wilderness. May you someday find the humanity you so desperately lack." She dismissed them entirely. It was the most profound, devastating defeat they could possibly suffer. They were not destroyed by violence. They were entirely erased by her overwhelming, unyielding grace. The townsfolk erupted into a massive, joyous cheer, completely surrounding the towering woman who had just delivered them from absolute ruin. When the evening shadows finally stretched across the peaceful valley, the diner was quiet once again. The town was safe. The iron box rested safely upon the scarred wooden counter, its true purpose completely fulfilled. Matilda stood before the hot cast iron stove. Ezekiel approached her slowly from the shadows of the pantry. He reached out with his thick, sun-bronzed hands, gently wrapping his powerful arms entirely around her broad, heavily muscled waist. He rested his weathered cheek against her strong back. She turned slowly within his embrace, her massive hands coming up to cradle his deeply honorable face. "You did not have to give away the entire valley," whispered Ezekiel, a quiet smile touching his lips. "I kept the exact piece I truly wanted," murmured Matilda, leaning her resolute face forward to rest her forehead against his own. "The iron has completely remembered how to sing, Ezekiel. The hearth is entirely warm. We hold absolutely everything we need." They shared a quiet, deeply profound kiss in the flickering lamplight, their lonely souls finally finding their permanent, beautiful home within each other. The giant, abandoned woman and the stoic, silent protector rebuilt the diner together, feeding the rugged frontier with ancestral magic and absolute love, their bond as enduring and unbreakable as well-seasoned cast iron. The quiet embers of our campfire are slowly burning down into a soft, glowing red, my friends. The harsh mountain wind has settled, and the deep, peaceful night surrounds us. As we close the heavy iron lid on this remarkable memory, I want you to sit quietly with the profound lesson Matilda and Ezekiel leave behind. We live in a world that so often measures our worth by the superficial shape of our bodies, the thickness of our coin, or the agonizing scars we carry upon our shoulders. The cruel world looked at a towering, immensely powerful woman and saw only a grotesque anomaly to be feared and discarded. They entirely miss the gentle, profoundly nurturing heart beating within her broad chest. But Ezekiel possessed the quiet, observant wisdom to look far beyond the physical armor. He recognized that true, enduring strength is absolutely never found in the ability to tear down others. It is found exclusively in the unyielding capacity to protect, to build, and to unconditionally heal. Matilda held the absolute power to destroy her enemies with the ancient deed, yet she chose the far heavier, far braver path of profound mercy. She proved that the darkest, most painful wounds of our past do not have to dictate our future. We all carry rusted, neglected iron within our souls. We all carry the heavy burden of past rejections and unspoken fears. But if we possess the courage to scour away the bitter rust, to forgive those who could not understand our unique shape, and to apply the warm, protective oil of genuine love, our hearts can learn to sing once again. Thank you for sitting by the fire with me tonight. May your own hearth remain forever warm, and may you always find the quiet courage to see the profound beauty hiding within the giants among us. This story is a work of fiction intended for entertainment and emotional reflection. The characters, locations, and events are entirely products of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual historical events is purely coincidental. The themes of emotional healing, frontier survival, and culinary traditions are presented in a family-safe, PG-rated context. This narrative strictly adheres to all YouTube Partner Program, YPP, guidelines, containing no graphic violence, explicit material, or harmful content.